In the summer of 1944, Europe trembled under the echo of artillery fire. After the D-Day landings, the Allies had poured into France, driving deep into Nazi-occupied territory. But what awaited them in the dense fields and narrow lanes of Normandy would become one of the most brutal and decisive battles of the entire war. For Hitler, Normandy was supposed to be the place where his enemies would bleed to death. He had promised his generals that the Atlantic Wall, a chain of bunkers, guns, and mines stretching along France's coastline, would hold firm. But by August, that illusion had shattered. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now in chaos, scrambling to survive as the Allies closed in from every direction. At the heart of this disaster was a single word that every German soldier would remember with dread: Falaise. The Falaise Pocket wasn't planned by fate. It was engineered through relentless coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces. Their goal was clear: to trap and annihilate the German 7th Army before it could retreat east toward the Seine River. Once the pocket closed, tens of thousands of Nazi troops would be crushed inside, like prey in a steel vise. As the operation began, the Allies advanced from both north and south. From the north came Canadian forces under General Crerar, fighting their way through tough resistance. From the south, the U.S. Army's General Patton's Third Army roared forward, his tanks cutting through villages and wheat fields at lightning speed. Meanwhile, inside the collapsing German lines, panic reigned. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of German forces in the west, sent frantic messages to Berlin. He warned that the situation was desperate, that his men were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. But in his headquarters, far from the battlefield, Adolf Hitler refused to listen. "No retreat," Hitler demanded. "You will stand and fight where you are." It was an order that would doom thousands. By August 12th, Allied divisions were closing around the German armies like tightening jaws. Smoke and dust filled the skies as retreating columns of German vehicles tried to escape the trap. Convoys stretched for miles, trucks, tanks, horse-drawn wagons, all jammed together on narrow country roads. Allied fighter bombers circled overhead, turning the roads into killing zones. Witnesses described scenes of horror and confusion. Soldiers ran from burning vehicles, horses screamed, and ammunition trucks exploded like thunder. Entire battalions were wiped out before they could even find cover. The once disciplined German army was now a shattered mob, fighting not for victory, but for survival. In one small town near Trun, Canadian infantry found themselves face-to-face with desperate German troops trying to break through. The fighting turned savage, street by street, house by house. The air reeked of smoke and blood. By nightfall, hundreds lay dead on both sides. And still, Hitler refused to allow retreat. The Allies could sense it. Victory was near. But there was one gap left in the encirclement, one corridor that had not yet closed. Through that narrow opening near the town of Chambois, tens of thousands of German soldiers would try to flee. The Allies had to move fast before the trap snapped shut completely. As darkness fell over Normandy, flares illuminated the battlefield. Tank engines rumbled, wounded men cried for help, and in the distance, the glow of burning convoys lit up the horizon like a second sunrise. The German army, once feared across Europe, now faced annihilation. The stage was set for the final collapse, and in the heart of the chaos, one question echoed among Allied soldiers. Would the Germans escape the trap, or would this be the end of Hitler's Western dream? The sun rose over Normandy on August 14, 1944, casting its light on a battlefield consumed by chaos. Smoke curled above the shattered French countryside, where entire German divisions were on the run. The once proud 7th Army, the backbone of Hitler's Western defense, was collapsing. From the air, Allied pilots could see the panic below. Roads were choked with retreating vehicles, trucks carrying ammunition, tanks sputtering in the mud, and soldiers marching aimlessly through the smoke. Every few minutes, the sound of an Allied Typhoon fighter screamed through the sky, unleashing rockets that tore into the German columns. Each pass left more destruction: twisted metal, shattered trees, and burning convoys that turned daylight into dusk. The Germans called it the Corridor of Death, and it was closing fast. While Canadian and British forces attacked from the north, General George S. Patton's Third Army surged from the south. Patton's tanks moved like predators, cutting through fields, forests, and shattered villages. His commanders knew they were about to seal the fate of tens of thousands of enemy troops, if they could link up with the Canadians in time. Inside the German High Command, panic was spreading faster than ever. Field Marshal von Kluge, trapped in the confusion, tried desperately to organize a retreat. But communication lines were collapsing, and his orders were intercepted or delayed. Meanwhile, Hitler, sitting in his wolf's lair in East Prussia, refused to accept the truth. He believed the reports were exaggerated, that his generals were weak, even traitorous. When von Kluge begged for permission to withdraw, Hitler's response came in a single word: no. That one decision sealed the fate of the entire 7th Army. By August 16th, the Allies were ready for the final strike. American divisions under General Bradley pushed north toward Argentan, while Canadian General Crerar ordered his forces to advance south from Falaise. Between them lay a gap barely 10 miles wide, the last escape route for the German army. But closing that gap wasn't easy. The terrain was treacherous: rolling hills, thick hedgerows, and narrow roads that forced tanks to move in single file. German units, desperate and cornered, fought like wild animals. Even as Allied artillery rained down, they counterattacked with whatever they had left. Panzer tanks with little fuel, teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth, and SS units sworn to fight to the last bullet. In the small towns of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive and Chambois, the battle turned into one of the fiercest close-quarter fights of the war. Canadian, Polish, and American troops clashed with German remnants in streets littered with bodies and burning vehicles. Every building became a fortress, every road a killing field. Witnesses described scenes that defied imagination: tanks exploding at point-blank range, soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in the rubble, medics working under constant shell fire. The cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of artillery, forming a soundtrack of pure chaos. And yet, slowly, relentlessly, the jaws of the trap began to close. By August 19th, the pocket had shrunk to a mere few square kilometers. The air stank of fuel, blood, and decay. German columns tried to break out under cover of night, slipping through the fields and forests, but Allied flares turned night into day. Machine guns opened up, mortars thudded. The escape routes became slaughter zones. The next morning, Canadian and Polish troops linked up. The Falaise Pocket was finally sealed. Inside were more than 50,000 German soldiers, trapped, exhausted, and surrounded. For days, the fighting continued inside the pocket as the trapped Germans tried to break free. But it was hopeless. Allied artillery fired relentlessly, turning the countryside into a landscape of death. Whole divisions ceased to exist. Tanks lay overturned in ditches, their crews dead beside them. Horses, trucks, and wagons lay tangled together in scenes too grim for words. Field Marshal von Kluge, realizing the catastrophe, knew his career, and perhaps his life, was over. On August 18th, after leaving his headquarters, he took poison and ended his life on a roadside in France. His replacement, Field Marshal Model, would later tell Berlin, "There is no longer any Western Front." He wasn't exaggerating. The destruction of the Falaise Pocket marked the collapse of Hitler's armies in France. Within weeks, the Allies would be at the Seine River, and soon Paris would be free. But for the soldiers trapped in that pocket, Normandy had become their grave. And for Hitler, the nightmare was only beginning. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was now watching it crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of his own arrogance. The morning after the trap closed, the fields of Normandy were silent. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence of death. All across the Falaise Pocket, smoke still rose from smoldering wrecks. Burnt-out tanks lay like skeletons in the grass. The air was thick with the stench of fuel, gunpowder, and death. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead or dying, their uniforms torn, their faces blackened by soot. Allied soldiers who advanced into the area would never forget what they saw. The road between Chambois and Mont-Ormel became infamous, later known simply as the Corridor of Death. Truck after truck filled with corpses, horses still harnessed to wagons, tanks crushed and melted into the mud. Some German soldiers had died trying to crawl out of their burning vehicles. Others still clutched weapons, as if fighting ghosts that weren't there. An American officer wrote in his diary, "It was like walking through hell itself. The smell of death was everywhere. For the survivors, there was no victory, only exhaustion. Allied troops had fought for weeks, sleeping in ditches, eating cold rations, and pushing through relentless rain. Many looked upon the destruction with numb disbelief. They had won, but the price of victory had scarred their souls." Back in Berlin, Hitler refused to believe what had happened. Reports of 50,000 men lost were dismissed as enemy lies. When his generals insisted the Seventh Army had been destroyed, Hitler exploded in fury, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. "The Wehrmacht does not retreat," he shouted, pounding the table. He demanded fresh counterattacks that didn't exist, divisions that were already gone. To the dictator, admitting defeat was unthinkable. To his generals, disobedience meant death. Inside his bunker, the walls were closing in. Messages from France grew darker by the hour. Units missing, commanders captured, whole corps wiped off the map. For the first time, even the most loyal officers began to whisper that Germany's defeat was inevitable, but no one dared say it aloud. Meanwhile, on the ground, the consequences of Normandy were spreading fast. As Allied divisions pushed east, the German lines disintegrated. The retreat turned into chaos. Soldiers abandoning vehicles, horses bolting through the forests, civilians fleeing in every direction. What had begun as a strategic withdrawal became a full-blown collapse. On August 25, 1944, just days after the Falaise disaster, the unthinkable happened. Paris was liberated. Crowds poured into the streets, waving French flags, throwing flowers at American tanks. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in 4 years. For the people of France, it was freedom reborn. But for Hitler, it was a humiliation beyond words. He raged for hours, ordering the city to be destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. Paris must not remain, it must burn. But General Dietrich von Choltitz, commanding the city's defenses, ignored the order. He refused to become another monster in Hitler's madness. The Western Front was collapsing faster than anyone could have imagined. The remnants of the German army staggered back toward the Rhine, their morale shattered. Whole units were down to a fraction of their strength, starving, broken, and leaderless. For the first time, even the SS units, once feared across Europe, looked beaten. American forces advanced so rapidly that even General Eisenhower was astonished. In a single week, his armies had crossed more than 200 miles, capturing towns, bridges, and supply lines. The Allies were now deep inside France, their next goal clear: push the Germans all the way back to their homeland. But even amid victory, new challenges emerged. Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Tanks ran out of fuel. Ammunition had to travel hundreds of miles from the beaches, and soldiers were worn down by exhaustion. General Patton famously complained, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have to drink gasoline." As the Allies paused to refuel, Hitler seized the moment to issue a desperate order: hold the line at all costs. He declared that Germany's western border, The Siegfried Line would become an impenetrable wall. Propaganda broadcasts promised that the fatherland would rise again, that the enemy would be stopped at the gates. But deep down, everyone knew the war had turned. The momentum was gone. The invincible Reich was bleeding out. Inside his wolf's lair, Hitler's inner circle began to fracture. Generals whispered about surrender. Resistance groups formed within the army, and ordinary Germans began to lose faith in the man who had promised them victory. Normandy had done more than destroy an army. It had destroyed an illusion, the myth of German invincibility. The Western Front, once Hitler's pride, had become his graveyard, and in the ruins of France, the world saw the first clear sign that the end of the Third Reich had already begun. In the weeks after the disaster in Normandy, the German army was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. Across France and Belgium, what remained of Hitler's once feared divisions limped eastward, ragged and starving. Their boots were torn, uniforms filthy, their tanks running on fumes. Columns of prisoners marched the other way. Thousands of captured Germans trudging through the mud under Allied guard. For many, the war was finally over. But for Hitler, it had only just begun. Inside his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, the Führer was surrounded by maps, reports, and lies. His generals tried to soften the truth, but even the most loyal ones couldn't hide the scale of the catastrophe. The Western Front had ceased to exist. Entire corps had vanished in the Falaise Pocket. The Seventh Army was gone. Thousands of officers were missing. And with them, the last hope of stopping the Allies before they reached the German border. When Hitler finally grasped the reality, his rage was volcanic. He blamed everyone, his commanders, his allies, even the weather. "It is treachery, sabotage, cowardice," he screamed. No one dared contradict him. Those who did were replaced, arrested, or executed. The truth, that his own stubbornness had doomed the Western Front, could never be spoken aloud. Meanwhile, the Allies pressed forward relentlessly. American and British tanks rolled across northern France like an iron tide. Bridges were captured before they could be blown. Railways repaired overnight, supply convoys roaring east. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, ran day and night, keeping Patton's and Montgomery's armies fueled and armed. German defenses crumbled faster than anyone expected. By early September, the Allies had reached the River Seine, and soon after, the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg. The myth of German invincibility was gone, shattered beyond repair. For the soldiers who once marched proudly under the swastika, there was only fear and confusion. Orders changed hourly. Communication lines broke down. Officers told their men to hold their ground, but no one even knew where the ground was anymore. In the east, the Red Army was on the move too. Stalin's forces had smashed through Poland and were racing toward Germany's heartland. For Hitler, the nightmare was closing in from both sides. Inside his headquarters, the tension was unbearable. The air smelled of stale smoke and sweat. Generals whispered behind closed doors, terrified not just of defeat, but of their leaders' growing madness. Every setback, every retreat, every report of loss was met with violent outbursts. Hitler no longer trusted his commanders. He replaced experienced officers with loyal fanatics, men who promised to obey, not to think. Orders went out for civilians, boys, and old men to form new militias, the Volkssturm, and prepare to defend the Reich with rifles from World War I. Germany was being consumed from within, not just by war, but by delusion. Outside, Allied reconnaissance planes flew freely over the collapsing front. They photographed everything: roads jammed with refugees, convoys of fleeing soldiers, bomb bulgers, and burning towns. In the ruins of Normandy, bulldozers buried the dead, German and Allied alike, in long rows of makeshift graves. The war had become an endless procession of destruction. For many German soldiers, surrender became an act of mercy. They laid down their weapons not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. After 5 years of fighting across continents, they simply had nothing left to give. An American officer summed it up best. "We didn't break them with bullets. We broke them with time." By late 1944, Hitler's empire was a shell of its former self. Factories were bombed into rubble. Oil supplies were running out. The Luftwaffe was crippled. And yet, even in the face of total collapse, Hitler still dreamed of a final victory. He called for one last offensive, a desperate gamble to turn back the tide. An attack through the forests of the Ardennes, the same place where his army had triumphed in 1940. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge. But deep down, everyone knew. The war was lost long before that battle began. The real collapse had already happened in the fields of Normandy, in the smoke and blood of the Falaise Pocket, when the road to Berlin opened for the first time the Western Front. Once Hitler's shield had become his tombstone, and, as his shattered armies stumbled back toward Germany, the world prepared for the final act, the fall of the Reich itself.